Montana Territory, October 1879. The wind that night carried the scent of coming winter and the weight of desperate choices. Abigail Morrison sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her sleeping daughter in the pale moonlight that filtered through the cabin's single window. Emma's breathing was shallow, her tiny chest rising and falling, with the labored rhythm of slow starvation. At 18 months, she should have been walking, babbling, exploring the world with boundless curiosity. Instead, she lay motionless as a porcelain doll too weak even to cry. The silence in the cabin was deafening, no crackling fire in the hearth, because there was no wood left to burn, no bubbling pot, because there was nothing left to cook, no sound of life, because life itself was slipping away one breath at a time. Abigail pressed her hands against her hollow stomach, feeling the sharp edges of her ribs through the threadbare fabric of her dress. When had she last eaten? 2 days ago, 3. The gnawing hunger had become so constant, she barely noticed it anymore, like a wound that had stopped bleeding but never stopped aching. She reached beneath the bed for the worn leather satchel, the same bag that had carried her wedding dress from Philadelphia 3 years ago, when the world still held promise, and Robert Morrison's letters had painted Montana Territory as a land of golden opportunity. The leather was cracked, now scarred by harsh winters and broken dreams. Tomorrow, it would carry the last remnants of her dignity to Bear Creek Trading Post, where she would do the unthinkable. The words had been rehearsed 1,000 times, but they still felt like broken glass in her throat. I'll trade her, my baby, for bread. The thought made her stomach clench with revulsion so violent she had to grip the bed frame to keep from vomiting. What kind of mother even considered such a thing? What kind of woman reached a point where selling her child seemed like an act of love rather than abandonment? But what choice remained? The cornmeal was gone, scraped from the barrel 3 days ago, along with mouse droppings and weevils she'd been grateful to find. The last jar of preserves had been empty for a week, licked clean by desperate fingers that trembled with hunger and shame. Robert's brother Jacob had promised help after the funeral 6 months ago. Family takes care of family, he'd said with that politician's smile that never quite reached his eyes. But his letters had grown increasingly vague before stopping altogether. The neighbors faced their own struggles. Mrs. Patterson down the creek had buried her youngest son last month, too weak from malnutrition to fight off the fever that should have been survivable. The Hendersons had abandoned their homestead entirely, loading their few remaining possessions onto a wagon and heading back east toward family and civilization, and the kind of help that existed in places where people remembered what mercy looked like. The territorial supply trains that should have sustained them through winter had mysteriously failed to arrive, leaving entire communities balanced on the knife's edge of starvation. Official explanations blamed weather-difficult terrain. Indian raids, always something that absolved the territorial government of responsibility, while providing no actual relief to the people slowly dying under their protection. Abigail rose and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass that separated her from a world that had grown increasingly hostile. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of campfires from the Cheyenne encampment north of Bear Creek. The Indians, Robert had always called them savages, painting them as bloodthirsty demons who lived only to torture and kill white settlers. But desperation had a way of reshaping perspective, and hunger cared nothing for the color of skin or the language spoken around a fire that provided warmth. Maybe if she offered Emma to them, her daughter would at least have a chance to survive. The Cheyenne knew how to live off this harsh land, how to find sustenance where white settlers saw only emptiness. They understood survival in ways that parlor-raised Philadelphia women never would. It would mean never seeing Emma again, never hearing her first words or watching her take her first steps, never being there to comfort her when nightmares came or celebrate with her when joy arrived. But life, any life, was better than watching her waste away in this cabin that had become a tomb for dreams. A sound outside made her freeze the soft whinny of a horse, followed by careful footsteps on the porch that creaked under Robert's boots just 6 months ago when he'd come home from the fields for the last time. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized someone was approaching at this ungodly hour. Bandits looking for whatever scraps remained, drifters seeking shelter from the cold. Or worse, men from Klaus Dietrich's mining operation, come to collect on debts she couldn't pay with money she didn't have. The knock, when it came, was surprisingly gentle. A voice called out in accented English that carried authority without threat. "Mrs. Morrison, do not be afraid. I bring no harm to you or your child." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She recognized that voice. She'd heard it at the trading post, speaking with calm dignity to Jeremiah Hawkins about supplies and fair prices. A Cheyenne warrior called Hotoke, whose very presence seemed to command respect from both his own people and the white settlers who dealt with him. Windwalker, some called him for his ability to move across the territory like a ghost made of smoke and shadow. "What do you want?" she called through the door, her voice barely steady enough to form words. "To speak about tomorrow, about the choice you plan to make." The words hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and sending her stumbling backward from the door. How could he possibly know? Had her desperation become so obvious that even strangers could read her intentions? Had she somehow betrayed herself in town? Let slip some hint of the terrible decision that had been eating at her soul for days. With shaking hands, she unbarred the door and opened it just enough to peer out. Hotoke stood in the moonlight, like a figure carved from the night itself, tall and imposing in traditional buckskin and beads, his black hair braided with leather strips that caught the silver light. But his dark eyes, when they met hers, held something she hadn't expected to see from a man of his reputation compassion. "How did you—" "Small territory. People talk when they think others don't listen." His gaze moved past her to where Emma lay sleeping, taking in the hollow cheeks and labored breathing with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too much suffering. They say Widow Morrison grows desperate that her child grows thin as autumn ice. They say tomorrow you go to trading post with heavy heart and terrible plan. Shame burned in Abigail's cheeks like acid, hot and corrosive and impossible to hide. The entire territory knew. Her private agony had become public spectacle, her maternal desperation transformed into gossip, shared around dinner tables and in saloon corners. Everyone knew what she was planning, and no one had lifted a finger to help. "I don't know what you've heard, but you would trade daughter for food because you think it only way to save her life." The blunt words shattered her composure, completely stripping away the last pretense of dignity she'd been clinging to. "Because you love her too much to watch her die and not enough to find better way." Tears streamed down her face as she gripped the door frame for support, her knees threatening to buckle under the weight of truth spoken without mercy or judgment. "She's dying. I don't have anything left. No money, no family willing to help, nothing to trade except child who needs mother more than she needs food." "That's not true." The words exploded from her with surprising vehemence. "Food keeps her alive. I'm failing her. Every day she gets weaker and I can't stop it. I can't save her. I can't even feed her. And you think Cheyenne can—" "I think you know how to survive on this land. I think you understand things about living that I never learned in Philadelphia, drawing rooms, and church socials." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of dirt and salt on skin that had grown pale from too many days spent indoors, hiding from neighbors who might see how far she'd fallen. "I think maybe she'd have a chance with people who don't depend on supply trains that never come. and promises that are never kept. Hotoke was quiet for a long moment, studying her, with those penetrating dark eyes that seemed to look straight through to her soul. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler than she'd expected from a man who carried himself like a war chief. 3 winters ago, my wife died birthing our second child. Son lived only 5 days, not enough milk, not enough warmth, not enough of the things children need to fight their way into this world. His jaw tightened with old pain that had never quite healed. I know the weight of watching a child slip away. I know the desperation that makes impossible seem reasonable, that turns love into something that looks like abandonment. Then you understand why I have to. I understand why you think you have to. But there is another way if you have courage enough to trust an enemy. What other way? I've tried everything. Begged from neighbors who have nothing themselves, wrote letters to family who never respond, even approached the territorial officials who make promises that evaporate like morning mist. Her voice cracked with exhaustion and defeat. What other way is there? You have not tried trusting someone who owes no debt to your people, who gains nothing from your success, who has every reason to let you fail. Hotoke stepped closer, and she could see the lines around his eyes and the scars on his hands, the weight of leadership that sat on his shoulders like an invisible burden. You have not tried trusting me? The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implications she couldn't begin to process. Trust a Cheyenne warrior. Trust the enemy her husband had warned her about, the savage who supposedly lived only to kill and destroy everything civilized people held dear. I don't understand. Tomorrow you go to trading post as planned, but not to trade child to meet me there at noon. Bring daughter, bring what little you have left, and trust that some debts can only be paid with kindness rather than gold. Why would you help us? We're strangers. She struggled for words that wouldn't sound insulting. We're not even the same people. Because starving child sees no color when death comes calling. Because desperate mother deserves chance to remain mother. His expression softened slightly, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the warrior's mask. And because my daughter Ayana asks each day why the white woman's baby cries at night. She hears your vigil through the wind, and it troubles her sleep. The revelation that her nightly struggles had been witnessed, that even Cheyenne children were aware of Emma's suffering, brought fresh tears to Abigail's eyes. She'd thought herself isolated, alone with her pain and fear. But apparently, her grief had been echoing across the territory, reaching ears that heard not just the sound of crying, but the deeper music of maternal love and loss. I didn't know anyone could hear. Sound carries far in empty land, especially at night, when silence makes every whisper into a shout. But hope carries even farther when it finds the right ears to receive it. He turned to leave, then paused at the edge of the porch, where moonlight painted his face in silver and shadow. Mrs. Morrison, tomorrow you choose between fear and trust, between keeping child and losing her, between dying slowly and living differently. Choose wisely, because some chances come only once. Then he was gone, melting back into the darkness like a shadow given substance only by moonlight and desperate hope. Abigail stood in her doorway for a long time after his footsteps faded, staring at the place where he'd been and wondering if desperation had finally driven her completely mad. But when dawn came, bringing with it another day of Emma's labored breathing and her own gnawing hunger, the memory of Hotoke's words felt like the first real hope she'd known in months. Maybe, just maybe, there was another way. The Bear Creek trading post squatted against the Montana horizon like a weathered gravestone, its log walls dark with age and bitter winters that had scoured away any pretense of welcome. Abigail clutched Emma closer as the October wind cut through her threadbare shawl, each gust a reminder of how far she'd fallen from the woman who'd once hosted church socials in Philadelphia. and worried about whether the silver was properly polished for Sunday dinner. Her wedding ring had been sold 3 weeks ago for a handful of cornmeal that lasted exactly 4 days. The pale band of skin it left behind was like a ghost of better times, a reminder of promises made in a different world by a different woman who'd believed in happy endings and divine providence. Inside the trading post was a study in scarcity that reflected the broader struggles of the territory. Shelves that should have groaned under the weight of supplies stood nearly bare, a few dusty cans of beans, some hardtack so moldy it was more green than brown bolts of coarse fabric that spoke to utility rather than comfort. The air smelled of mouse droppings and disappointed hopes. Behind the counter, Jeremiah Hawkins looked up from his ledger with eyes that had seen too much desperation to offer false comfort. He was a good man. Abigail knew he'd extended credit when he could traded goods for promises when cash was impossible. Turned a blind eye to the small thefts that hunger sometimes drove decent people to commit. But even good men had limits, and Jeremiah's had been reached months ago. Mrs. Morrison. His voice carried the weight of bad news. Before he even spoke it, the tone of a man who'd had this conversation too many times, with too many desperate families. Told you last week there ain't nothing left to. Please. The word escaped like a prayer torn from her throat. Emma hasn't eaten in 2 days. I can work clean, do anything you need. I'm not afraid of hard labor. Jeremiah glanced at the baby in her arms, taking in the pale skin and hollow cheeks, the way Emma's eyes had grown too large for her face. At 18 months, she should have been toddling around the store, getting into everything, with the boundless curiosity of childhood. Instead, she lay limp as a rag doll, too weak even to lift her head. Ain't work to be had, Mrs. Morrison. Mine's been closed 2 months now, no supplies to keep the operation running. Half the territory's starving and the other half's packing up to leave. He gestured helplessly at his empty shelves. Federal supply train was supposed to come through last week, never showed just like the 3 before it. But surely there must be something. Nothing I can spare that won't take food from my own family's mouths. I'm sorry, but that's the truth of it. Behind her, the door chimed with the hollow sound of metal on wood. She turned to see a figure that made her heart stutter with recognition. Hotoke, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence filling the cramped space, with the kind of quiet authority that couldn't be taught or bought, only earned through years of making life and death decisions for other people. He wore traditional buckskin and beads, but also a silver medallion that marked him as someone who dealt regularly with white authorities. His black hair was braided with leather strips and decorated with eagle feathers that caught the lamplight as he moved. Most striking were his eyes, dark as midnight, but holding depths of intelligence and compassion that challenged every stereotype Abigail had been taught about his people. Jeremiah, he said, nodding to the shopkeeper with the casual familiarity of someone who'd conducted business here many times before. Mrs. Morrison. His gaze met hers briefly, and she thought she saw encouragement in those dark depths. You Hotoke. Jeremiah's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle beneath his counter. Not from fear exactly, but from the kind of nervous habit that came from living on a frontier where yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's enemy without warning. Didn't expect to see you here today. My people are hungry too, the warrior said simply. Came to trade for what supplies you might have. Got nothing to trade for. Been telling everyone the same thing for weeks now. Jeremiah spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. Supply trains ain't running, and what little I got left won't feed a family for more than a day or 2. Hotoke reached into the leather pouch at his side and withdrew a handful of gold coins that caught the lamplight, like tiny suns, more wealth than Abigail had seen in months. $20. For whatever you have that might keep children alive another day. Jeremiah's eyes widened at the sight of so much money. $20 was more than most territorial families saw in a year, enough to buy passage back east and a new start in places where civilization still functioned properly. He began gathering what little remained: the cans of beans, a small sack of flour, some hardtack that was mostly edible if you picked out the worst of the mold. Watching the transaction, Abigail felt the last of her options crumble away, like a house of cards in a windstorm. If Hotoke was buying everything available, there would be nothing left for her, even if she found something to trade. The plan she'd agonized over all night, the terrible necessary sacrifice she'd prepared herself to make, suddenly seemed as futile as everything else in her life had become. But then she remembered his words from the night before, his promise of another way if she had courage enough to trust him. Maybe this was part of that plan. Maybe he was creating an opportunity rather than destroying one. Wait. She heard herself say the word, torn from her throat like a physical thing. I have something to trade. Both men turned toward her, Jeremiah, frowning in confusion, while Hotoke's expression remained carefully neutral. She could see him watching her, evaluating, waiting to see what choice she would make when the moment of truth finally arrived. "Mrs. Morrison, you ain't got nothing left to..." "I do." The words felt like swallowing broken glass, each syllable cutting her throat as she forced them out. She looked down at Emma, then back up at the warrior, whose offer of help had somehow brought her to this moment anyway. "My baby, I'll trade her to you. For food. For the chance at life I can't give her." The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with shock and disbelief, and the kind of moral horror that decent people felt when confronted with desperation so complete. It turned love into something that looked like abandonment. Jeremiah's face went white as old bone, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to process what he'd just heard. "Jesus Christ, woman, you can't just..." "She's dying anyway." Abigail whispered, tears streaming down her face in hot tracks that felt like acid on her cold cheeks. At least with him, maybe she'd have a chance. The Cheyenne know how to survive on this land. They know things about living that I never learned. Hotoke stared at her for a long moment that stretched into eternity, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that seemed to look straight through to her soul. She could see him weighing her words, measuring her desperation, trying to understand what could drive a mother to offer up the thing she loved most in all the world. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle, but carrying undertones of steel that spoke to the warrior beneath the diplomat's mask. "You would give away your child to a stranger, to an enemy of your people." To save her life, yes. The admission felt like tearing out her own heart and laying it bleeding on Jeremiah's counter. "I'm a widow with nothing left to offer. No food, no money, no family willing to help, no way to care for her properly. But you could give her what I cannot. You could give her a future." The warrior was quiet for so long that Abigail began to think he hadn't heard her, or that he was considering whether accepting such an offer might bring more trouble than it was worth. The Cheyenne had enough problems with territorial authorities without adding accusations of child stealing to their list of grievances. Then slowly, he reached out and touched Emma's thin cheek with one calloused finger. The baby stirred slightly at the contact, her eyes fluttering open to focus on his weathered face, with something that might have been curiosity or recognition, or simply the instinctive response of a child to gentle touch. "Nope," he said finally, his voice carrying absolute finality. Abigail felt the world collapse around her like a house built on sand, her last desperate hope crumbling into dust and despair. "Please, I'm begging you." "No trade for child." His voice was firm but not unkind, holding the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Child belongs with mother, not with strangers who speak different language and worship different spirits. But then what? But you come with me, both of you. The simple statement hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Abigail stared at him in confusion, unable to process what he was offering or why he would make such an offer to people who had nothing to give in return. I don't understand. My village, 3 miles north beside the creek where cottonwoods grow thick enough to break winter wind. You come with me. We feed child, feed mother, give both chance to grow strong again. Jeremiah sputtered a protest that sounded more reflexive than heartfelt. Now, hold on. You can't just take... I take nothing, Hotoke said calmly, never taking his eyes off Abigail. I offer. She has choice: stay here and watch child die slowly, or trust enemy to save what she cannot save alone. Abigail stared at him, searching his face for deception, for cruelty, for any sign of the savage she'd been taught to fear since childhood. Robert had filled her ears with stories of Cheyenne brutality, of white women stolen and tortured, of children raised as slaves in Indian camps, where civilization was just a memory, and Christian mercy was unknown. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like understanding, the recognition of one parent by another, the acknowledgement that some bonds transcended the artificial divisions that politics and prejudice had created between peoples who might otherwise have found common ground. "Well, why?" She whispered the word, carrying all her confusion and desperate hope. "Why would you help us? Why would you risk bringing trouble to your people for the sake of strangers who can give you nothing in return?" For the first time since entering the trading post, Hotoke's stone facade cracked slightly, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the warrior's mask. "Because I have daughter too. Same age as yours, maybe little younger. Because 3 winters ago I held my own dying child and felt the same desperation that I see in your eyes now." He paused, and Abigail could see memories moving behind his eyes, like shadows cast by firelight, painful memories that had been carefully buried but never completely forgotten. "Because my son died anyway, despite everything I tried to do to save him. Because I know what it means to fail a child you love more than your own life." His voice grew softer, more personal. "Because no child should die for the failures of adults, who cannot find ways to share what the earth provides freely." The weight of that revelation settled between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of understanding through assumptions and prejudices that had seemed solid as bedrock just moments before. Here was a father who had walked the same dark path she was traveling, who had felt the same crushing weight of inadequacy and desperation, who understood better than anyone what it meant to consider the unthinkable in service of love. "If I come with you," she said slowly, testing each word like stepping stones across a rushing stream. "What happens to us? What becomes of a white woman and her child in a Cheyenne camp? Child lives. Mother lives. Beyond that." He shrugged with the kind of fatalistic acceptance that came from living in a world where survival was never guaranteed. "We see what tomorrow brings. But today both live. That is enough to start with." It wasn't much of a promise, barely more than acknowledging that the sun would rise and set whether they were there to see it or not. But it was infinitely more than she had now. More than the slow death that waited in her empty cabin, more than the terrible choice she'd been prepared to make. Abigail looked down at Emma, at her labored breathing and pale skin, at the way her daughter's eyes had grown too large for her face. The choice, when it came down to it, was no choice at all. "All right," she said, the words coming out stronger than she'd expected. "I'll come with you." Hotoke nodded once, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of formal agreement, then turned back to Jeremiah. "The coins. Give food to woman." "But you said you wanted..." Give food to woman. The warrior's tone brooked no argument, carrying the kind of authority that came from years of making decisions that other people's lives depended on. With shaking hands that betrayed his own emotional state, Jeremiah gathered the supplies he'd been preparing and passed them to Abigail. The bundle felt heavier than it should have weighted, with the unexpected kindness of a man who had every reason to be her enemy, but had chosen to be something else instead. "You sure about this, Mrs. Morrison?" Jeremiah asked quietly, his voice carrying genuine concern beneath the practical worry. "Once you leave with him, ain't no telling what might happen. Folks in town, they might not understand, might think—" "Let them think what they want," Abigail replied with a dignity that surprised them all, including herself. "My daughter is dying. He's offering her a chance to live. What would you do?" Jeremiah had no answer for that, because they all knew what any parent would do when faced with the same impossible choice. The ride to the Cheyenne village passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through autumn grass that had turned the color of old gold. Abigail rode behind Hotoke on his magnificent bay stallion. Emma nestled between them, already seeming to breathe easier in the crisp air that carried the scent of sage and distant snow. The horse was a revelation in itself. Not the wild, barely tamed Mustang she'd expected, but a carefully trained animal that responded to the slightest pressure from its rider's knees, moving with the fluid grace of a creature perfectly adapted to its environment. Everything about Hotoke spoke of the same careful attention to detail, the same harmony between human will and natural law that her husband had never understood despite years of trying to force this land into the patterns he'd known back east. "Your daughter," she said eventually, needing to break the silence that had grown heavy with unspoken questions and half-formed fears. "What's her name?" "Ayanna means little flower in your tongue. The child who hears Emma crying at night." Children hear many things adults miss, especially when their hearts are open to suffering they do not yet understand. Hotoke's voice carried the kind of gentle wisdom that came from watching young ones grow and learn. Hearts speak the same language no matter what color skin wraps them or what words they use to name the world around them. The observation was so simple and yet so profound that Abigail found herself thinking about it as they rode through country that grew more beautiful with each mile. Rolling grassland stretched to the horizon, painted in shades of gold and brown that shifted with each gust of wind. Stands of cottonwood marked the path of hidden streams, their leaves already touched with the yellow of early autumn. In the distance, mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks touched with snow that would soon blanket the entire territory in winter's harsh embrace. It was vast and empty and utterly indifferent to human suffering, but also possessed of a kind of austere beauty that took her breath away. She'd never really seen it before, too focused on survival and loss to appreciate the landscape that surrounded their small human dramas. Now riding behind a Cheyenne warrior toward an uncertain future, she began to understand why this land inspired such fierce loyalty in the people who truly knew it. The village appeared as they crested a low rise, nestled in a bend of the creek, where cottonwoods provided shelter from the prevailing winds. It was smaller than she'd expected, perhaps 30 lodges arranged in a loose circle, with gardens and horse corrals scattered around the periphery. Smoke rose from cook fires, where women tended evening meals, and she could see children playing near the water, while men worked on weapons and tools in the fading daylight. What struck her most was how normal it all looked. She'd expected something primitive, barbaric, a collection of savage dwellings that spoke to lives lived outside the boundaries of civilization. Instead, she saw a community that functioned with the same rhythms as any farming village back east, people going about the business of daily life, caring for their families, preparing for the challenges that tomorrow might bring. Their arrival caused a stir that spread through the camp like ripples on still water. Conversations died as people turned to stare at the white woman riding behind their leader, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to outright hostility. Abigail felt the weight of their gazes like a physical thing pressing against her, with questions she couldn't answer and judgments she couldn't influence. An older woman emerged from the largest lodge, her gray hair braided with silver ornaments that caught the firelight as she moved. Her face was lined with age and wisdom, but her eyes were sharp as flint as she took in the scene before her. This was clearly someone of importance, a grandmother or elder whose opinion would carry significant weight in whatever decision the tribe made about these unexpected guests. Grandmother, Hotoke said respectfully, dismounting with fluid grace and helping Abigail down from the horse. He spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, his words carrying the formal cadence of someone making an official report to a superior. The woman grandmother replied in the same language, her tone questioning, but not harsh. Other villagers had gathered now, forming a loose circle around them that felt both protective and potentially threatening. Abigail caught her own name mentioned several times, and then Emma's, followed by words whose meaning seemed clear enough from the context, even if she couldn't understand the specific language. Finally, grandmother stepped forward and held out her arms in the universal gesture of someone asking to hold a child. "Give, baby," she said in heavily accented English that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Every maternal instinct Abigail possessed screamed against handing her daughter to a stranger, especially one whose language and customs were so foreign to everything she'd known. But Emma was growing weaker by the hour, and this woman's eyes held the kind of competent kindness that spoke to experience with children and their needs. With trembling hands that betrayed her emotional state, Abigail passed her daughter to the Cheyenne elder. Grandmother examined Emma with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to evaluating suffering and determining what could be done to alleviate it. Her weathered fingers were gentle as they checked the baby's breathing, felt her forehead for fever, looked at her eyes and mouth with the practiced assessment of someone who had guided many children through illness and injury. "Hungry," she pronounced finally, her English careful but clear. Cold, scared, but strong spirit underneath all that. Will live if given what she needs. Relief flooded through Abigail so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled, forcing her to grip Hotoke's arm for support. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face in tracks that felt warm against her cold cheeks. "Thank you so much." Grandmother spoke again to Hotoke, her tone taking on the commanding quality of someone issuing orders rather than making suggestions. He nodded and began addressing the gathered villagers, his words formal and carrying the weight of leadership that would make his decisions binding on the community. "What did you tell them?" Abigail asked, when the crowd began to disperse, some people returning to their interrupted tasks, while others lingered to steal curious glances at the newcomers. "That you are under my personal protection, that any who harm you or your child will answer to me directly." His dark eyes met hers with something that might have been reassurance. "It will be enough to ensure your safety. For now. And later you will have to earn your place here the same way everyone does, by proving that you can contribute more than you take, that you understand the difference between sharing and charity, that you respect our ways, even when you do not fully understand them." 3 months later, January 1880. Winter had transformed the Cheyenne village into something that existed outside of time, wrapped in snow and silence that muffled the outside world until it seemed as distant as a half-remembered dream. Abigail sat in grandmother's lodge watching Emma play with Ayanna and the other children in the warmth created by carefully tended fires and the accumulated wisdom of people who understood survival in its most fundamental form. Emma had grown robust and healthy, her cheeks pink with vitality rather than pale with malnutrition. She chattered constantly in a mixture of English and Cheyenne that delighted everyone who heard it, switching between languages with the unconscious ease of a child who saw no difference between the words her mother had taught her and the ones she'd learned from her adopted grandmother and sister. The transformation in her own life had been equally dramatic, though harder one. The first weeks had been a constant struggle to understand not just the language, but the entire social structure that governed life in the village. Everything from food distribution to child care operated according to principles that had nothing to do with the individualistic philosophy she'd grown up with, and everything to do with collective responsibility for community welfare. She'd made mistakes, serious ones, that had required intervention from Hotoke or grandmother to smooth over hurt feelings and cultural misunderstandings. But gradually, through patient teaching and careful observation, she'd begun to grasp the complex web of relationships and obligations that held the community together. White Dove Woman learns quickly. Grandmother observed, using the name they'd given her during the informal adoption ceremony that had made her acceptance official. But still thinks too much like white person sometimes. "How do you mean?" Abigail asked, looking up from the beadwork she'd been practicing under the older woman's tutelage. "You ask, 'What can I do?' when you should ask, 'What does community need?'" Grandmother's weathered hands never paused in their work on a new pair of moccasins, her fingers moving with the automatic precision that came from decades of practice. Small difference in words, but big difference in thinking. That evening, as the village settled into the quiet routines of winter life, Hotoke found Abigail sitting outside her lodge despite the bitter cold, staring up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear mountain air. "Restless tonight?" he asked, settling beside her on the log that served as an informal bench. "Thinking about what comes next, about what happens when spring arrives and the outside world remembers we exist." It was a conversation they'd been avoiding for weeks, but one that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. The territorial government had made no official inquiries about her disappearance, but that could change with a spring thaw when travel became easier and political pressures increased. Jacob Morrison's continued silence was particularly ominous. He was not a man to forget family obligations, especially when those obligations might serve his own interests. "You worry about your husband's brother. Among other things, Jacob has connections throughout the territorial government. If he decides I've been kidnapped or coerced..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both understood what federal intervention might mean for the fragile peace that currently existed between the Cheyenne and territorial authorities. "And if he decides you came here willingly, then I'm a traitor to my race, living in sin with savages corrupting my daughter with heathen influences." Abigail's laugh held no humor. "Either way, I become a problem that needs to be solved." Hotoke was quiet for a moment, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air as he considered the implications of her words. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had wrestled with similar problems for years. "There is third possibility you have not considered." "What's that?" "That Jacob Morrison has reasons of his own for not pursuing the matter. That his silence serves his interests better than action would." "What kind of reasons?" Instead of answering directly, Hotoke pulled a folded paper from inside his winter coat, a document that looked official despite being somewhat travel-worn. "Supply manifest from federal convoy that never reached Bear Creek Trading Post. Found it last week when my hunters came across abandoned wagon train 15 miles south of here." Abigail took the paper and held it close to the firelight, streaming through the lodge's entrance, squinting at the small print that detailed shipments of food medicine and other supplies intended for territorial distribution. The quantities were staggering enough to feed every family in the region for months, all of it officially designated for civilian relief. This is from last October, the train that was supposed to arrive just before I met you at the trading post. Yes, along with 3 others from earlier in the season, all marked as delayed by weather or lost to Indian raids. Hotoke's voice carried grim satisfaction. But weather does not steal wagons, and Indians do not forge official papers redirecting supplies to private warehouses. The implications hit her like a physical blow. The starvation that had driven her to consider trading Emma, the desperation that had forced dozens of families to abandon their homesteads, the crisis that had brought her to the Cheyenne village, all of it had been artificial, created by someone systematically stealing federal aid for private profit. Jacob? She whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water in her veins. Federal Marshal has authority to redirect supply trains to investigate reports of Indian activity to ensure that government property is protected from theft. Hotoke's smile was sharp as a blade. Very convenient for someone who profits from territorial suffering. 6 months later, federal investigation and trials. Spring came early to Montana Territory in 1880, bringing with it not just melting snow and budding trees, but a federal investigation that would change everything. The evidence Abigail and Hotoke had gathered during the long winter months provided the foundation for a case that reached all the way to Washington, D.C. Federal agents descended on the territory with the methodical thoroughness of professionals who had seen corruption before and knew how to root it out. Klaus Dietrich was arrested at his mining compound, surrounded by enough stolen federal property to supply a small army. The warehouses Abigail had described were found exactly where she'd said they would be, filled with supplies that should have reached desperate families months earlier. Jacob Morrison was taken into custody while trying to flee the territory with saddlebags full of gold coins and correspondence detailing the entire criminal enterprise. His final letter, never sent, was addressed to Confederates in Wyoming Territory. The corruption had spread far beyond Montana's borders. The trials were swift and decisive. Federal judges, embarrassed by the scope of the scandal and eager to demonstrate their commitment to justice, handed down sentences that sent a clear message: corruption would not be tolerated. Klaus Dietrich received 20 years in federal prison, though he would serve less than 6 months before dying in his cell, under circumstances officially ruled suicide. Men who built fortunes on others' misery rarely lived long once their protection was removed. Jacob Morrison was sentenced to 15 years hard labor. He lasted 2 years before a mining accident ended his story permanently, the kind of accident that happened to unpopular prisoners with alarming regularity. But the investigation led to more than individual punishment. Systematic reforms throughout the territorial administration prevented similar abuses in the future. Supply chains were reorganized under federal oversight. Corruption investigations became routine rather than exceptional. Officials who had looked the other way suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny. Miss Beatrice Hartwell, who had tried to help during the crisis, was appointed to head a new territorial relief agency. Dr. Samuel Chambers established a network of clinics throughout the territory, funded by federal commitment to preventing future crises. Most importantly, the investigation led to a complete reevaluation of territorial Indian policy. The old system of broken promises and systematic cheating was replaced by agreements both sides could live with, guaranteed reservation boundaries in exchange for mineral rights that provided steady tribal income. The adoption ceremony. September 1880. The aspen trees surrounding the Cheyenne village had turned gold with autumn's arrival, their leaves whispering ancient secrets as 2 peoples gathered to witness something unprecedented: the formal adoption of a white woman and her child into the tribe. Through ceremonies that would make them legally and spiritually part of the Cheyenne Nation. Abigail knelt in the ceremonial circle marked with sage and sweet grass, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the drums and singing that filled the evening air. She wore traditional dress the village women had spent weeks creating, soft buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork, telling the story of her journey from desperate widow to valued community member. The design was symbolic rather than decorative. The morning star pattern on the bodice signified new beginnings and restored hope. Bear claw designs on the sleeves represented protection and maternal strength. Most significantly, the medicine wheel beadwork around the neckline showed the four directions coming together in harmony, symbolizing her role as a bridge between two worlds that had been enemies too long. Hotoki stood before them in ceremonial regalia, reflecting his status as both war chief and peace negotiator. Behind him, representatives from 3 other tribes had come to witness this unprecedented event, Crow, Blackfeet, and Lakota leaders who wanted to see history being made. The presence of other tribes made this more than local adoption. It was a statement about peaceful coexistence possibilities, demonstrating that white and Indian peoples could find common ground when approaching each other with honesty and mutual respect, rather than fear and prejudice. Woman who was called Abigail Morrison. Hotoki began in English, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd of perhaps 100 people. You came to us in great need, seeking only survival for yourself and your child. But in staying, you have given more than you have taken. You have stood with us against those who would destroy us. You have shared our struggles and victories alike. He switched to Cheyenne for the formal recitation, ancient words, flowing like music, as he recounted her deeds in the language reserved for important occasions. Abigail understood enough now to follow the general meaning, how she had helped expose the supply train theft, how she had testified before federal authorities at personal risk, how her presence had helped bridge gaps between peoples who had been enemies for generations. The recitation continued for nearly an hour, covering not just her actions, but the broader context of White Cheyenne relations and why this adoption represented a new chapter in that often tragic history. Other speakers added their perspectives, grandmother talking about Emma's integration, senior warriors describing Abigail's contributions during difficult winter months, children sharing memories of games and stories that brought laughter to long, cold nights. When formal speeches concluded, grandmother stepped forward carrying a wooden bowl filled with water from the sacred creek herbs, floating on its surface like tiny prayers. She dipped her fingers in the mixture and touched Abigail's forehead, speaking words of blessing that seemed to resonate in the air around them. With this water from our sacred places, we wash away who you were before, the old woman said in careful English, carrying the weight of ancient ritual. Today you are born new, as daughter of the people's sister, to our sister's mother among our mothers. The naming ceremony came next, each elder contributing to discussion of what Abigail's Cheyenne name should be. They spoke of her journey from desperation to hope, her courage in facing powerful enemies, her devotion to Emma, even when it meant risking everything. The debate was conducted in Cheyenne, but Abigail could follow enough to understand different possibilities being considered. Some favored names emphasizing her role in bringing justice. Others preferred those highlighting maternal dedication or willingness to trust former enemies. Still others wanted something commemorating her unique position as a bridge between worlds. Finally, after much discussion and what appeared to be formal voting, Hotoke announced their decision. You will be known among us as Mape Kokohona, woman who brings justice. This name you have earned through your actions, and this name will be remembered by generations yet to come. For Emma, still too young to understand, but old enough to smile at the attention, they chose Ayana Nako, little flower who laughs. It reflected both her joyful nature and her bond with Hotoke's daughter, the original Ayana, who had become like a sister. The name also carried deeper meaning, hope that her generation would grow up knowing friendship where their parents had known conflict. The formal adoption concluded with gift exchanges, sealing their new relationship. Blankets and beadwork from the community symbolized acceptance into the web of kinship and obligation holding the tribe together. Horses and weapons marked their full membership in a society where everyone was expected to contribute to collective defense and prosperity. In return, Abigail pledged to honor Cheyenne traditions while maintaining her heritage, to raise Emma with knowledge of both worlds, to serve as a bridge between peoples separated by misunderstanding too long. It was a delicate balance, carefully negotiated over months of patient discussion. As the sun set over the ceremony, painting the sky in gold and crimson, matching the autumn leaves, the entire village joined in a feast lasting deep into the night. Stories were told of other times when enemies became allies, when desperate situations led to unexpected friendships, when individual courage changed history for entire peoples. The most important story told that night was still being written, and the story of a white woman and her child who found family among former enemies, and in doing so helped create possibilities for peace previous generations could never have imagined. Bear Creek Trading Post, October 1881. Exactly 1 year after Abigail had first walked through its doors, prepared to trade her baby for bread, she returned as a different woman entirely. The shelves that had been nearly empty now groaned under supplies, federal aid flowing through channels that could no longer be corrupted, private merchants competing fairly for customers who actually had money, thanks to the economic recovery following systematic theft elimination. Emma toddled between aisles with the confidence of a child who had never known real want, chattering in English and Cheyenne that had become her natural language. At nearly 3, she was healthy, bright, and curious, a living testament to communities choosing cooperation over conflict, sharing over hoarding, trust over fear. Mrs. Hell, what am I supposed to call you now? Jeremiah Hawkins looked up from his ledger-weathered face, creasing into genuine smile. Heard tell you got yourself an Indian name that's near impossible for white folks to pronounce. Mape Kokohona, officially? Abigail replied with laughter, holding none of the desperate edge it might have carried a year ago. But Abigail works fine for old friends. Hard to believe it's been a year since that night when you came in here ready to... He trailed off, glancing at Emma with wonder. Look at her now, healthy as a horse and twice as ornery. The Cheyenne have been good to us, better than we had any right to expect. Heard the territory's been good to them too, with new treaties and mineral rights agreements. Funny how things work out when folks try being fair instead of looking for ways to cheat. The transformation hadn't been automatic or easy. The investigation had led to complete reevaluation of territorial Indian policy, forcing officials to confront that many problems stemmed from their own corruption rather than inherent Native American hostility. New agreements were revolutionary in their fairness, guaranteed boundaries for mineral rights, providing steady tribal income, joint resource management, benefiting both communities, legal protections, preventing future systematic cheating. The bell chimed, and Hotoke entered, wearing the silver badge marking him as federal deputy marshal charged with ensuring compliance with tribal agreements. It gave him real authority to investigate and prosecute violations, a radical departure from the old system where Native Americans had no legal recourse. He nodded to Jeremiah and smiled at Emma, who immediately ran to him with enthusiasm reserved for favorite people. Uncle Windwalker, she cried, using the English translation she'd settled on. Mama says we're getting supplies for the new school. Is that so, little flower? He swept her up, spinning until she dissolved into giggles, filling the trading post with joy. And what will you learn? Reading and writing and numbers and Cheyenne stories and white people stories too. Teacher says all children should know both kinds so they understand each other better. The school was Abigail's latest project, though she'd had help from dozens recognizing its importance. A joint venture between the Cheyenne village and Bear Creek settlement, it served children from both communities in classes taught by teachers fluent in both languages and cultures. It was revolutionary, the first truly integrated school in Montana Territory, where white and Native American children learned together rather than in separate institutions that had been the Western norm. But it had backing from territorial officials, eager to demonstrate commitment to cooperation policies and federal funding, making it a regional model. The lumber for the new classroom addition, when will it arrive? Hotoki asked Jeremiah. Our next week, right on schedule. Amazing what happens to delivery times when supply trains aren't being hijacked by corrupt marshals. As they gathered supplies, books and slates for school food and clothing for families, trade goods for exchange with other tribes, Abigail reflected on changes since that desperate night. The territory prospered now that corruption was rooted out and honest men ran essential services. Federal aid flowed to those needing it, private businesses operated fairly, and Montana's various peoples were learning to coexist as neighbors rather than fighting over artificially scarce resources. Her transformation was perhaps more dramatic, though harder won through months of patient bridge building. The desperate widow ready to trade her child had become a respected community leader, a cultural translator, a living example of what cooperation could accomplish when people chose trust over suspicion. But Emma's transformation was most remarkable and hopeful. The dying infant who nearly slipped away was now a thriving child belonging fully to both worlds, white and Cheyenne English and native future, and past joined in one person who saw no difference and no reason they couldn't coexist perfectly. Ready to head home? Hotoke asked as they finished loading supplies. Home. Abigail repeated, tasting the word and finding it sweeter than memory. Yes, I think we are. As they drove toward the village that had become sanctuary and future, Emma fell asleep between them, lulled by steady wagon wheel rhythm and quiet adult conversation. The sun set behind mountains, painting sky in gold and crimson that had witnessed so many moments shaping their lives together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to build a world where children could grow up without knowing fear and hatred, dividing their parents' generation. Tonight, traveling home through country once hostile, but now welcoming, Abigail Morrison Emahpe Kokahona, woman who brings justice, was content holding her daughter close and trusting the future would be better than the past. The story of the woman who begged to trade her baby for bread had become territorial legend, not as desperation's tale, but as proof that the most broken situations could heal when good people chose trust over fear, cooperation over conflict, and love over hatred, poisoning too many lives, too many generations. In the end, she had traded everything, not her baby, but her old life, old assumptions, old fears about people seeming different, but sharing fundamental hopes and dreams. She received something far more valuable than bread, family transcending racial boundaries, community valuing justice over profit, and a future worth believing in.